Hello and namaste. Welcome to the almost daily ZenCast. Today is Monday, September 21st, and the show has been on an unscheduled hiatus. Where to begin? That's the question I've been wrestling with and confronting on a daily basis. I've been looking around at the public discourse, the landscape of public discourse, and to be honest, it has become in recent weeks just a tad bit overwhelming. So much has happened. So much is currently happening. So much seems to be on the verge of happening. And for a while now, it has felt as if it is all happening all too quickly. So quickly that it soon becomes nothing much more than a blur. I could, I suppose, rattle off a list of facts, in quotation marks. In fact, I could spend days discussing and unpacking what has happened in the last 3 weeks, the last 3 months, the last 3 days. It has been an exhausting breakneck speed of never-ending news, breaking news, breaking news, breaking news. I even tried. I started to make a bullet point list. I wanted to be able to go and read to you or rattle off some examples in the form of, saying from this insert first event here to that insert final event here, and have 1, 2, 3 examples of it. I wanted to fill that bullet point list of 3 empty slots with actual real life examples. And honest, I tried. It wasn't a lack of examples that was the problem. It was an overwhelming cornucopia of too many examples, all of which seemed worthy of attention, none of which I could decide between. From that, I could have, in theory, summarized my, quote, take on things and said a few sentences like, from insert first opinion here to insert final opinion here. But frankly, after days of racking my mind, even the most generic references or choices I could make there, just trying to put that list together in and of itself felt tacky. Like it's not enough, and also too much at once, and all but unbelievable that these are the examples, that this cloud of recent events must even be addressed. It's been mind-boggling. I do not say these things and I do not ask these questions frivolously. Although I can understand why I may be accused of doing so. Where to begin? How to begin? With what to begin? I have been wrestling with these questions and the doubts that form around them for weeks now. Long, tedious days and endless, mind-numbing nights of overthinking thinking everything to the point of paranoia. And yet, at some point, I stopped myself and asked me, myself, and I, what are the things that actually unite us? And just asking that question feels good. There is an aspirational nature to just the act of asking that question. So I pray that people never give up asking that question of themselves and of each other. You know. But when I wrestled with that question, I did not want to ask that question in the aspirational sense. I did not want to be asking the rose-colored glasses version of that question. I did not want to be asking that in the theoretical sense of wondering what it is that we might discover that maybe, just maybe, might give us something to rally around, something that we might all unite behind. No, I wanted to know, what are the things that unite us in actuality, in fact of the matter, in form if not function? What is going on? What unrecognized thing, event, energy, or experience are we all sharing universally as a collective species right now? Is that even a real question? And trust, I wrestled with that issue for some time. But if you take the question seriously and look past the obvious and the the sarcastic ways one might reply to that, and the kinds of answers that one starts arriving at might make you stop and ask, can we even ponder these things, right? Because we're talking about pain. Can we really talk about the universal pain, the trauma, the grief, the suffering? Because that's why I can't bring myself to talk about the other things. All the practical, political, cultural, logistical, mundane things of the world that are worthy of being outraged about, or worthy criticizing, or worthy of having public discourse. They seem impossible to approach to me at times because I am so seemingly aware to some degree or another that looming larger and deeper and more profoundly mind-boggling than all of those things is this deep universal suffering. It can be said that all souls alive today are suffering from deep spiritual trauma. Now, some might say, no, not I. And some might point to others and be like, they couldn't possibly be. But I say to you, even the most well-off, even the most middle class of the most middle class, even the most polite and outgoing, even the most seemingly currently in the best of moods and successful amongst us, is experiencing spiritual pain, spiritual suffering, spiritual trauma, a grief and a form of pain, form of suffering and remorse and grief that predates, preempts, and predicates the madness that we're witnessing in the world. Not only are all souls suffering, but to some degree or another, we are caught up in the involvement, the participation, the collusion, to choose a choice word, in the sort of inevitable suffering of all those around us. And we can try the best we can to navigate the mental gymnastics required to say, I'm not participating. And we can refuse to give consent, which is a noble thing to state, but we're all bound up in it. We were all born into this world that is the result of generations worth of suffering and the perpetuation of suffering and the denial of suffering and the taking advantage of those who suffer, etc., etc., etc. And we have, at every turn, in every lifetime, in every generation, done what we can to make do with what we can to get by, to survive. And so those of us alive today, we were born into lifetimes upon lifetimes of that. And yet we don't really have the tools to discuss these things, right? How can we discuss these things? To someone who's not prepared or not thinking about the world in such terms, statements like that might sound ridiculous. And in the face of this unlimited arsenal of distractions and a never-ending array of valid and invalid themes or subject matter to discuss and debate and argue about. In the face of all this conflict, in the face of all this chaos, what can be said? I have struggled with this, right? As someone that is tinkering with this experiment of producing a podcast on a somewhat regular basis, I have struggled with this overwhelming sense that poking fun at Trump is just, I can't, criticize, even legitimate criticism. It's still like, but the suffering. How do we turn a blind eye to all the suffering in the world for all the different reasons? Just getting into detailing and disambiguating all the ways in which humanity is living through some painful form of suffering can become a slippery slope of arguing about what forms of suffering are the worst or the best, or, And in taking this time off, I mean, the most difficult thing has been to sit with the sensation, the knowledge, the empathetic attempt to relate to the simple, horrible fact that there is so much suffering in the world. And if I had to put that in writing, I would put a lot of extra O's on purpose. And simultaneously, it is also sort of obvious, right, that this statement has always been true. That in and of itself is a mind-numbingly painful thing to come to terms with. There has always been too much suffering in the world. And yet this year, it seems more obvious, more visible, more palpable. Somehow this year it all seems more urgent, more prevalent, more inescapable. If I may, dear listeners, talk about my own obstacles in the recent days and weeks, I have, in all honesty, been unable to think clearly. I've been unable to bring myself to speak. I've been on this hiatus from creating this podcast because I have honestly been unable to bring myself to press record for lack of knowing how to address this all, how to acknowledge this deep and powerful sense that it's painfully obvious, and yet it also must be reckoned with all of the suffering going on in the world around us. I've been stuck, not from fear so much as a sort of general sense of anxiety that seems to come from a vague understanding or sense or feeling that my words would not ever be meaningful enough. In the face of all that suffering, in the face of all that human tragedy, in the face of all that is going wrong in the world, in this country, in other countries, in people's lives, I felt this overwhelming dread that nothing I could say would be meaningful enough to be worth doing it, to be worthy of recording and setting out there in the world. And to a certain degree, I have been unable to get past that. It seems to be impossibly true. And it is because of that that I therefore, with humility, with the humility of someone who understands that all the words in the world might never be enough, that I invite you to join together in taking a moment of silence to simply honor that suffering going on around us everywhere. And also because this sort of thing should not be considered negative, right? To honor suffering, to acknowledge it, to broadcast love and light at it, to bring it into focus and to bring it into attention is to be able to broadcast love and light at it, I think. Yes? And if we do that, then in theory, one hopes we are facilitating all those who might need that little bit of help, that a burst of loving spiritual energy through prayer and practice can give. Namaste and thank you. In preparing for this episode, my memory recalled that a certain meme had recently come to my attention. It had flowed across my screens. And it was someone's tweet, actually, technically. I guess maybe not a meme, depending on where the technical definitions are drawn and the lines are defining. But it was a screen capture of someone's tweet sharing a thought, a criticism, a statement correcting the old adage of all of us being, quote, in the same boat. I don't have it up in front of me, and I wish I did. I had only sort of written a note in reference to it as I was sort of thinking out my thoughts for today's episode. But the essential message that I recall gathering was that the truth is we are not in the same boat. We are, in fact, all in different boats of different sizes, of different strengths and qualities. And what we have in common is that we are all sharing the same rough seas. I remember that kind of stopping me in my tracks, and I had to think about it. Was someone just being snarky? Or is there truth to that? And I think that with time, I came to resonate that indeed there is a deep truth in that should not be overlooked. It's similar to the tradition in spirituality communities referencing the spiritual path, that there's the general sort of singular notion of it, and there's also the understanding that there isn't one true spiritual path, right? That every human individual every last one of us is treading a path that in some way or another is complete and total, singularly specific to our own journey, our own life experiences. The path that we are walking down, or I guess if we're going to stick with the boat analogy, sailing through, that doesn't make sense, but the path that we are on is simultaneously one of extreme isolation. It is hours and hours alone. and yet intrinsically bound up in everyone else, right? We are born alone out of our mother, right? It's an interesting catch-22. We die alone, and that one's a little bit harder to see, but I mean, we don't really, because when we die, with us there is death and all that it is on the other side of life. We are indeed in different boats. Arguably, to borrow from the spiritual path analogy, our own private boats. And indeed, my friends, the seas are rough. And as circumstance would have it, some of us are in bigger boats. Some of us are in smaller ones. But the thing that worries me is that we could get caught up in the madness and the chaos and the violent glee of fighting over whose boat is better. Fighting each other to find out whose boat is best. Or we could, with the somber understanding that all our boats are different, but we all long to survive the storm, and we all deserve to get to our destination, we could set aside the differences in our boats entirely and focus on organizing and working together so as to ensure that the entire motley flotilla survives the storm. Is that too much to ask? Some, I think, might feel inclined to say so, but I would argue that might be mostly because of the kind of ideological parameters that we adhere to, that we cling to, that we do not need to cling to. We can spend days upon days debating the function, form, and purpose of societally, one of those two words is the right word, socially adhered to ideological constructs. Is it a monolith of evil? No. Are there some socially adhered to ideological constructs that are useful? Of course. Are there some that are nonsense and totally pointless? Absolutely. Are there some that are kind of middle of the road and basically just weak-ass lame and we should revise and or upgrade and or just get rid of? Probably. And what do we do instead of having those kinds of well-thought-out, rational discussions? We fight over the righteousness of our chosen ideology. That's like fighting over the righteousness of our given boats. Instead of lashing them together, some might go, well, lashing a bunch of boats together is a horrible idea. But some might argue that it is indeed one way in which that all the boats can huddle together like in the analogy of the westward traveling caravans of early American pioneer days. The seas are rough, my friends. And everyone's boats are getting battered. If I'm going to just keep extending that analogy. And we're running out of time, one might argue, in terms of ensuring that the greatest good is achieved. The greatest possible good to benefit the greatest number of all of us, right? Some might disagree with that mentality. I do think that if we are to continue fighting without transcending some of the fundamental imaginary roadblocks and boundaries that we've invented for ourselves, that we're never really truly going to find satisfying solutions to the problems that we ourselves have created for ourselves. Here we are in this present moment. This moment now, this today, this momentum that is building, this history that is literally happening all around us, this series of chaotic events that we are living through. No matter how isolated we may feel, we are all bound up in it together. No matter who you are, no matter how upfront and up close to the action you may be, or how far off and distantly you may be observing it all, we are all involved in this process. And we are all impacted by the cumulative actions and the cumulative outcomes that we create. Now, none of that is the cause of our suffering, but it is the truth of the fact that all souls are suffering. Even those that are in denial or simply unaware. Ego is, of course, right there in the thick of things, hiding in plain sight. And we can spend days upon days unpacking that and how we see that in the world's current events. And ego's frolicking through the hearts and minds of everybody is, of course, to blame, I guess, for lack of a better term, for so much stress and frustration and anger. That's stress with an SH at the end, because, no, I just got a little mushy mouth. There's so much stress and frustration and anger, so much pain and grief and anguish. And I think, I could be wrong, folks, but I humbly am of the opinion that available to us are two very strong options. Are they the only two options? No. That's why we aren't pursuing the choice very actively. We're overwhelmed with options. We're overwhelmed with opportunities to place our attention, right? With urgent, frightening, scary things to call the most important. But we have to address and ultimately answer the question of, so where do we begin? How do we get started? And then to come full circle, it's been, sort of a microcosm of my own experience. I have been overwhelmed both as like a real life participant in my own daily life and as an aspiring commentator. Where do I, as a real life human being, focus my attention? Where do I, as an aspiring media persona, I love that oldie-timey Shakespeare version of the word persona. Where do I, an aspiring media persona, place my focus? Where do I, as a would-be entertainment personality, dig in as a starting point? Like, where do I anchor myself? What do I ground my next episode in? What have I got to say? And for weeks I've asked myself every day, where do I start today? How do I talk about any of this? Honestly, I've sat in frustration and sort of judgingly asked myself, how dare I want to pontificate about any of it? Who am I to speak on any given subject? And the ultimate question, of course, my friends and listeners, why should any of you hear me out? And the hard part has been that for the majority of the last 4 weeks, from August 31st, 2020, to today, September 21st, 2020, I have honestly, and in a sort of scary sort of way, I've just stared these questions in the face and struggled. I do not feel as though I actually have the answers to any of these questions. And yet, here I am, speaking to you, giving you my opinion, sharing with you my outlandish thoughts. And the irony is, I have a lot of those. It's just that there's so much. And I don't know if it's just my old age, if I've reached that age where it's all really downhill from here on out for me, and that's what I'm struggling with, or if the cacophony of crazy making out there in the political sphere, in the cultural sphere, in the Venn diagram that is the entertainment spheres that overlap on all these things. Like, has the cuckoo just gotten that over the top? Or is it me? Is it some weakness, some failure, some inability to see clearly enough? Is it some flaw, some unworthiness, some lack of talent, some lack of insight, some lack of ability? Where just a hot minute ago, I was full of vim and vinegar and ready to share my thoughts with the world. So it feels like. I now suddenly find myself stuck in this multiple weeks long glacier of these revolving door thoughts, this revolution of, not like a revolution, but like these revolving, I've already said that, these revolving door thoughts, this endless revolution of thinking things through to their logically cyclical lack of conclusion. I don't even know if that made sense, but I have fluctuated. I have felt at times as though I know some of the answers to many of these questions, but I just can't pick which one I should start with. Or truly, I have felt, conversely, as though I know nothing, am not worthy of addressing anyone. And yet, the compulsion remains, and after weeks, long, painful weeks of not bringing myself to fulfilling the act of creating another podcast episode, here I am at 41 minutes and 47 seconds of rambling at you, dear friends. Thank you for taking the time with me, even if it seems like I snuck it up on you, to take a moment of silence, as brief as it was. You are suffering, and I don't say that accusationally. Even if you don't want to recognize it, there is some spiritual pain in you. And I say this with compassion and empathy and sympathy, and the knowledge that it was very difficult for me to come to terms with that simple fact about myself. And that it continues to be like a stone around my neck, something that I struggle with, that even on my best days, when I feel competent and confident and all the good things that I could feel, deep down, deep down, underneath it all, there has always been this deep-seated, generally unacknowledged, somewhat overwhelming sense of spiritual trauma, pain, grief, discomfort, malaise, grief. I've already said that. I thank you for hearing me out. Even though it seems the critic in my head is already starting to break in and say, "You haven't said a damn thing, you fool. You've just been rambling about how you don't know what to say." I've been trying to ramp back up into doing the show after taking time I felt I needed to take because of what I've already said. I hit a wall. I hit a moment of being so aware of how little I really know, which is, that's a tough one to contend with, folks, especially because we live in a culture that's so rooted in ego affirmation that we don't want to acknowledge that kind of weakness, do we? And that might very well be something that is toxic and unhealthy for us as a society. At any rate, I hit a new wall in the last 48 hours. I knew that I could not keep dragging my feet. I knew that I had to take action. And now, with this most recent unannounced and unscheduled hiatus now officially over, I know, and I fully intend, and I pray that I am able to return my full attention and efforts towards creating new critical content for this podcast on an almost daily schedule for your listening entertainment, pleasure, and thoughtful consideration. And that's a frightening thing because I don't know what I'm talking about. I could talk about this crazy thing Trump did or this other crazy thing that Trump did. I should stop talking. I've been talking on way too long. It's 45 minutes and 55 seconds. But I thank you. That's my point. I thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in, checking it out, jumping around. And I welcome you if you're new. And this is the first or one of the first episodes of the show that you've listened to. Welcome. Welcome to the madness that is slices of the thoughts in my head splayed out for you in verbal diarrhea. May you find it entertaining. In terms of how this show should be listened to, it is not like your typical podcast product. It is most certainly not a serial, structured, you got to listen to it from beginning to end kind of show. It sort of appears to be like it might be that, but it isn't, not really. So feel free to jump around. Feel free to listen to a recent episode and then go all the way to the beginning and listen to one of the oldest episodes and then hop to the middle. Eventually, it'll either make sense or you'll come to some conclusion that I'm a crazy new age nut job, hippie, weirdo, cuckoo, talking out of his rear end about stuff he hardly understands. Whether or not that is actually the case, I will leave for you, my friends, to decide. But in the interim, for I must sign off now. I really have pushed the limit. I thank you again. And like I said, if you're super new to the show, I encourage you to jump around. And I humbly invite you to stay tuned as I will, knock on wood, be coming back at you stronger than ever before. Chock full of thoughts and opinions on what's going on in this cartoon crazy world of ours. As always, my friends, I hope that peace, love, and grooviness blossoms in your heart.